Hey everyone, it's Mr. Alvier again. Welcome back to another reading from Cabin on Trouble Creek by Jean Van Leeuwen. I'll be reading chapter 16 and maybe even chapter 17 during this session. We're heading into the month of February. Not just us, but Dan and Will. When we last left off at the end of chapter 15, Dan and Will were laughing and smiling for the first time, Daniel thought, since Pa left, maybe even before then. They had figured out how to get out there and walk in the snow and to be on top. Remember what they made? Yeah, snowshoes. Yeah, I mean, what else you gonna use, right? Good old Will, just like Pa. Daniel says, when you needed something, you just figure out how to do it, right? So here we are, the boys out playing in the snow, using their snowshoes to tramp around and have fun. When Will says, let's go check our snares. February. Chapter 16. The snares were empty, buried deep under the snow. Daniel wasn't surprised at that, but he was surprised to see tracks in the snow, quite a lot of them. Rabbit tracks, some smaller ones that he thought might be weasel or marten, and even smaller, feathery wisps of track. Bird, a mouse, and the sharp, clean footprints of deer. So it seemed there was game to be had, if they could just catch it. If only they had Pa's gun, Daniel thought longingly. With one shot, they could bring down a deer, and a deer had so much meat on it, it would last for many days, weeks even. And then they wouldn't have to be worrying about snares or spears. But they didn't have Pa's gun. They had to reset their snares. Daniel and Will worked carefully, setting the snares higher and concealing them as best they could with handfuls of snow. Stepping back, Daniel could barely make out their outlines against the vast sea of white. We'll catch some rabbits, Will said confidently, as they tramped on their snowshoes back to the cabin. I just know we will. He went out to check their snares every day, but every day he returned empty-handed. Maybe all those tracks belong to one rabbit, he said. One smart rabbit, added Daniel. The weather warmed some. The snow melted, dripping off the cabin roof. And then it rained for a whole day, melting more of the snow cover. The boys went out and reset their snares again. But still, day after day, Will returned without a rabbit dangling by its ears in his hand. Maybe, Daniel thought, something was wrong with their snares. Could be they stood out somehow against the snow. Or maybe he'd been right in thinking of rabbits sleeping away most of the winter in warm burrows. Whatever the reason, it was going on 2 weeks, he figured, since they'd had anything to eat besides Johnny cake and mush. Daniel found himself hungry most of the day, a gnawing, empty feeling. He'd even started dreaming about food. Ma's chicken and dumplings, smothered in gravy. Her pumpkin pie. One morning he woke up sure that he smelled it baking. When he saw Will stirring the pot of cornmeal mush as usual, he was so disappointed that he could barely crawl out of bed. The creek, which had been frozen solid, began flowing again. That gave Daniel a new idea. Why couldn't they try fishing once more? Not with Will's spear this time, but with homemade poles and lines made from plant fiber, and hooks carved out of bits of wood. That way there'd be little chance of Will falling into the freezing water again. Will didn't take to this idea very well. He was proud of his spear and proud of his skill at catching fish with it. Well, you can use your pole, he said, frowning. I'll stick to my spear. No, you won't, Daniel vowed to himself. Not while the creek bank and everything else was covered with a slick coating of snow and ice. But he didn't say that to Will. That night, Daniel worked at carving fishing hooks out of small splinters of wood. It was hard to get the right size and shape, and he threw most of his efforts into the fireplace. Finally, he got one that he thought might work, shaped from the branching Y of a twig. By that time, the light from the dying fire was growing dim. Daniel's eyes were tired and his fingers ached from holding the tiny bits of wood. "Oh, I'll do better in the morning," he said. As usual, Will went right to sleep while Daniel lay awake thinking. He wondered if the hook that he had whittled would really work. He'd need to tie on a stone to weigh the line down, he reminded himself. And that made him think of Pa and how he could always invent something to solve a problem. Maybe he and Will were starting to do that. Starting to be like Pa. Well, that led Daniel to another thought. One of those days that he'd stopped counting not too far back had been his birthday, January 14th. He hadn't given it any thought, but he was 12 now, just about grown. Some days he didn't feel like it at all, more like a toddling babe trying to cling to his pa's shirt tail. But other days he felt full grown, in fact, sometimes downright old. Would Pa be proud of him if he could see him now, Daniel wondered. The thought brought an unexpected wave of homesickness to Daniel that made him ache all over. What were Pa and Ma doing right this minute? And the little ones? Shy, serious Sarah. Round-faced Abby, always smiling. Funny Zeke. And the baby, probably crawling under everyone's feet by now. If they were all still alive. But they had to be. He'd know somehow if they weren't, wouldn't he? Daniel lay still, trying to bring their faces to mind. Strange, he thought. He could see Pa all right, and Ma, small and bony thin, always bustling about like a fluttering bird. He could never forget the wide smile that would unexpectedly light up her face. But the little ones were fuzzy in his head. Sarah, Abby, Zeke. Their features seemed to float just out of reach. Well, he was slowly floating into sleep, the faces blurring into swirling clouds of snow, when a sound outside brought him back. A sound of running. Some wild critter in the snow it must be. No, it's more than one. Wolves. Chasing their prey? Most likely, he thought. They were close to the cabin. Daniel sat up. He heard something thrashing about, some kind of struggle going on outside, and moments later, a muffled crash, and then silence. If it was wolves, whatever they'd been chasing, they had caught, and it was over. Daniel settled back beneath the blanket. As he was drifting off to sleep again, he heard another sound. High and long, echoing through the trees. And a moment later, an answering call from somewhere nearby. "Ow! Ow! 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 Ow!" Once, that sound would have made him shiver. Not now, he thought. The wolves are singing. And he went off to sleep. The next morning, Will set off to check their snares, while Daniel took out his knife to work some more on the fishhooks. But before he had even chosen a likely bit of wood, he heard a shout outside. "Daniel! Come and see!" Daniel opened the door and looked out. Will was standing at the edge of their clearing, and the first thing Daniel noticed was blood on the snow. A large, dark stain. And then he saw a deer lying next to it. No antlers. It was a doe, and a good-sized doe. And she was dead. So that was what he'd heard last night. Wolves chasing a deer out of the trees, running her until she was so exhausted that she couldn't run anymore, and then bringing her down right here, almost next to the cabin. "I'm coming!" he called to Will. Putting on his snowshoes, Daniel trudged over to where the deer lay, and as he got closer, he saw that the wolves had eaten their fill before leaving. The back legs and belly of the deer were torn up, a lot of her insides gone, but so much was left. Compared to a rabbit, a deer was a mountain of meat. He and Will looked at each other. "Meat," said Will. He was grinning so hard his face looked like it might split into two. "Tons of it," Daniel grinned back. He was amazed at their good fortune. No need now to think about fish hooks or rabbit snares. They had meat to last a good long time. They had to get it back to the cabin, though, and soon, in case the wolves returned or some other wild varmint with a taste for meat came along. Looking at the deer, suddenly Daniel realized something. It wasn't only the meat that they could use. The hide was valuable too. For clothing, shoes, laces, and probably much more. Solomon had been dressed all in deerskins, he remembered. So the two boys set to work skinning the deer. It was harder than Daniel expected, much harder than skinning a rabbit. It took hours before they finally had the hide separated from the meat. They laid it out on top of the second woodpile to dry, and it took more hours to chop up the meat with the axe and their knives. Some they buried under the snow in a kind of a box beneath the woodpile. There it would stay frozen, and, Daniel hoped, no wolves would find it. The part that they could use right away they brought inside. And then they couldn't wait any longer. They cut strips of meat and roasted it on sticks over the fire. The venison smelled so good cooking, they didn't even wait for it to be cooked all the way through. "It's ready," Will said eagerly. They devoured it, red juices dripping down their chins, almost like wolves themselves, Daniel thought. Looking at Will's face, it was bloody. Maybe people weren't so different from wild critters after all, even though they wore clothes. Like every other animal, they had to eat, right? And people spend the best part of their lives struggling to do it, Daniel thought. "Oh, that deer meat tastes good. Better than rabbit." There was more to it, like it would go right into the blood and build up a body's strength, too. Neither of them could stop grinning as they finished off those first pieces of meat and cut more. And for once, they didn't have to stop eating until they wanted to. And they didn't. The boys gorged themselves till Daniel thought he couldn't eat another morsel no matter what. He was stuffed so full he felt like his belly was going to split open if he tried to move. Will lay back, still smiling, as if he'd never stir again. "Tomorrow, we're going to make a stew," said Daniel. "Yeah, a big one," Will answered sleepily. "And we can use the bones and fat for soup," Daniel added. "After that, maybe the bones could be used for something else, like some kind of tools like the Indians made." "And there's the hide," Will reminded him. Yep, there was the hide too. The deer was a gift, Daniel thought, a wonderful gift. Except for Solomon, it was the best thing to happen to them since Pa left. And that's the end of chapter 16. I skipped over a couple things that I would normally stop on if I was reading to you in the classroom. I skipped over some figurative language. I read a sentence that said, the deer was a gift, right? The deer was a gift. It's kind of like a metaphor. It means much more than just an offering, right? It's useful for a lot of things the boys talked about. It's a gift. A deer, it's not really a present, is it? But it's a gift. It's kind of like a metaphor. Deer and presents, right? The deer was a gift. It is a gift. And there was another sentence a little bit back that said, next to a rabbit, a deer is a mountain of meat. Maybe it said it's like a mountain of meat. Maybe it was a simile, right? A deer and a mountain. The meat from a rabbit would be a small hill, right? Like a hill. And a deer would be like a mountain. A rabbit is like a hill, and a deer is like a mountain. Because of the size difference, I guess. A hill and a mountain. A rabbit is a hill, is like a hill, and a deer is like a mountain. Anyhow, these are ways that authors are able to help you see something, right? They help you visualize something by using what we call figurative language, and similes and metaphors are forms of language that help you visualize something. Next to a rabbit, a deer is a mountain. The author is trying to help you understand how much meat is there, and you can visually think in your mind that a rabbit is this size and a deer is this size, and there's so much more to the deer than there is to the rabbit, right? Metaphors and similes, and something that we would be talking about in class today. But we're not in class. Maybe you can explore metaphors and similes on your own. I think we've talked a little bit about metaphors and similes in our class on Zoom, but we would be doing so much more in the classroom. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this chapter. I was going to read chapter 17, but I've decided not to. It's starting to kind of be a little gusty outside right now, and I can tell my dogs are getting a little antsy with me being in the bedroom in here reading to you. I think they want to play. Anyhow, you know what to do. Go and brush those teeth. Go and wash your hands and your face, and tell your parents and your siblings you love them. And if it's not really your bedtime right now, then clean up. Let's get those toys off the ground. Let's put those clothes that mom and dad folded on top of your dresser. Let's get them inside the drawer, or if they're on the staircase, let's take them off the staircase and get them into your bedroom like you said you were going to. Did you bring your dirty laundry down to the laundry room? Did you put your bike in the garage? Maybe you have something left undone that you need to get finished before you go and brush your teeth and wash your hands and your face and get into your pajamas. Think about it. Or maybe you don't. Maybe you're ready to go to bed. I don't know. Anyway, have a great night. I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you for joining me again for this wonderful book called Cabin on Trouble Creek by Jean Van Leeuwen. Adios, amigos.